Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. A week ago, the Harvard School of Public Health released an analysis suggesting the death toll in Puerto Rico is almost certainly staggeringly higher than previously thought. In fact, researchers said that their survey suggests the number of deaths stemming from the hurricane could be 70 times higher than the current official estimate. Death tolls and mortality estimates are important. Not only is every loss of life a tragedy, but these numbers illustrate the full scope of this disaster. The American people deserve the facts about what happened to their fellow citizens. Equally important, these numbers drive the narrative about what happened in Puerto Rico and how our government responded and how we should rebuild going forward. We all remember when Donald Trump sat in Puerto Rico and pointed to a death count of 16, suggested Maria was not, and I quote, a real catastrophe. Well, the evidence is making it clear. Maria may be one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history. Again, the Harvard numbers are an estimate, but the most cited number from the Harvard study, 4,645, would rank this as the second worst natural disaster in U.S. history. Yes, Mr. President, this is a real catastrophe. So, Mr. President, when you are visiting FEMA today to mark the beginning of hurricane season, let's be clear. This is not the time for self-congratulations or victory laps. Sadly, we may never know the true number of deaths. However, going forward, we need transparency and a full accounting of the facts. In December of last year, Bennie Thompson, the ranking Democrat on Homeland Security, and I wrote to the GAO asking for an audit of how Puerto Rico conducted its death toll count. And this happened because we got hundreds of calls from people in Puerto Rico, from our own relatives, that were questioning the official count of 16 deaths. Funeral homes in Puerto Rico were all closed because they were tending to their families, because there was not electricity. We must go deeper. We need an analysis of how this low death count may have shaped the inadequate federal response. And this goes to the heart of the issue here. This is the argument, this is the narrative that defines the kind of response that Puerto Rico got from the federal administration, from this president. Now, this is an administration that is not known for its transparency. To that end, today, I'm calling for the establishment of an independent commission similar to what we have after 9/11 to examine the death toll, the federal response, and how FEMA and other agencies may have responded sluggishly based on artificially low numbers. I will also expect this commission to evaluate disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. I expect that once all the information is brought to light, we will find our government's inadequate response to Maria constitutes a stain on the moral conscience of our nation. This should never have happened, but for it to never happen again, we need the facts. And today, that is what we are asking for, a full, impartial, nonpartisan analysis of Maria's toll and our government's response. The relatives of all of those people who died, of all the victims, they deserve this examination. We owe this to them. And I implore and I beg the Republican leadership, who has been silenced since this Harvard report was issued. Shame on us, members of Congress, Republican leaders, who hasn't said a word to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, we need to get to the bottom of this. The American people deserve nothing less. It is my great honor now to introduce a good friend and colleague, Jose Serrano.
Thank you, Nydia. Good morning to all. Nydia has said it well. I'm just here to reiterate and support what we're doing here. Number one, for any of us as legislators to be able to propose funding, to propose agencies to move on behalf of needy communities that are in need, we need numbers. And it's obvious that the numbers we got were wrong. Now, whether it was because the municipalities could not communicate with each other, whether or not there was a bad response from the local government, whether or not there was no communications between the local government and the federal government, that cannot be the excuse used now. The question is, going forward, do we make sure that never happens again? At the same time, we are caught in a very difficult and emotional situation. We mourn the loss of so many lives. It could be 4,645. We don't know. Like Nydia said, we may never know. But we know this, that the number is much, 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 much higher than the 64 that has been reported. So we are calling not only for the establishment of this commission, but we're also calling on the White House to set aside time to say, what if another hurricane was to hit Puerto Rico? What would happen? I mean, they're in the middle of a recovery, maybe not even in the middle, at the beginning of a recovery. If another hurricane hits, only God knows what would happen. So we have to be ready and be ready for it. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, I reiterate the fact that we cannot argue on behalf of any one of you or any organization or any disaster or any situation, because if we don't have the right numbers, we don't have the proper argument. And so, Mr. President, we're asking you, yes, to tell FEMA to be ready, number one, and number two, a commission to tell us what went wrong. I've seen a lot of disasters in this country, and I've seen a quick response. The response to Puerto Rico was slow, and we have spent probably more time writing letters and phone calls asking agencies to respond, and still the response is not what it should be. So I'm here today to say, let's do it. We can do it. And one, let's find a way to properly find out who died, what they died of, was the lack of communication between them and the hospital or inability to reach a hospital, whatever, doesn't matter. If they died, they're part of the Maria tragedy. And secondly, let's make sure it doesn't happen again. I realize to the people that are watching this who have relatives who died that my words don't help you in any way. Your pain is still the same, but who knows, you may have another relative in danger, and we're trying to avoid that tragedy also in the future. So I hope our words are just a commitment to you of our sincerity and not to make you think that we're downplaying your suffering in any way. Numbers do have consequences, and these numbers do. Thank you. And it is my pleasure now to introduce a colleague and a great man, the ranking member on the Homeland Security Committee, Representative Bennie Thompson.
Thank you very much.
Bennie Thompson.
Yeah, Bernie is an oxymoron. I'm happy to be here to stand with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus in support of that effort to have this commission to review what occurred in Puerto Rico. I've been on the committee since its inception. I've gone through Hurricane Katrina, a lot of other natural disasters. What we saw in Puerto Rico was absolutely a failure to perform. This so-called death count is an effort, in some of our opinions, to play down the impact of what occurred. To that end, Congresswoman Velazquez and myself asked GAO to look at this and see whether or not these numbers are accurate. I'm happy to report to you that GAO has accepted our request and will be moving forward with that investigation and ultimate report. Be that as it may, we're now 1 week into another hurricane season. So the question is, are we prepared if something happened? Well, the notion is that 9 months, almost to the day, after Maria, we still have 15,000 people in Puerto Rico who still are without lights. So this is totally unacceptable. The lights are on in Texas, the lights are on in Florida, but somehow they are not on in Puerto Rico. And we need to find out why. And so this commission is absolutely important for us to look at. But as important is this notion that why would somebody give an undercount in a disaster? There has to be some motive for the perception of an undercount. So this commission will give us an opportunity to get to the facts. We've talked to public officials. All of us have been to Puerto Rico. We saw for ourselves firsthand the travesty that occurred with Maria. But the notion is that somehow in talking to officials and others that this count is only 64 is totally inadequate. So I join my colleagues here in supporting this commission. Let me now introduce Congressman Gallego from Arizona, the second vice chair of the CHC.
Thank you. It's also my pleasure to serve on the Natural Resources Committee, specifically the subcommittee that has oversight over Puerto Rico. And as members of the Natural Resources Committee, we've also asked for a hearing to see what occurred there. Let's be clear, potentially up to 5,000 even more Americans died because of lack of federal government action after the hurricane. It wasn't the hurricane that destroyed these lives. It was the fact that the Trump administration could not get their stuff together enough to save these Americans. I know I was on the phone with Northcom right after the landfall, asking where the assets were, how many assets were on the way, where the helicopters were, and all answers were totally inadequate. As a Marine, as someone who served in combat in Iraq, I had better access to resources in a quicker amount of time in the middle of the desert in Iraq than our fellow Americans did 3 hours flight from here, Washington, D.C. That is sad. This administration failed Americans. This administration's lack of action and thought killed many of these Americans. If this had happened in Florida, if this had happened in Texas, if it had happened anywhere in the mainland, this would be a national controversy. There would be hearings happening automatically. But for some reason, this administration feels it's acceptable to treat Puerto Ricans as second-class Americans. They are not. They are first-class Americans when they go fight for us overseas. They're first-class Americans when they come in home, unfortunately, in the coffins, and they should be treated like first-class Americans every opportunity they have. And that's why I joined in asking for this commission and for any efforts to find out and get down to the bottom of the truth. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to represent a colleague of mine, Representative Adriano Espaillat.
Thank you. Good morning. We all remember the photograph of President Bush on his plane hovering above New Orleans during Katrina. It became sort of like the poster child photo of neglect for that particular tragedy. Well, let me say this to you. Puerto Rico is clearly President Trump's most significant failure in his administration. To rely on the New England Journal of Medicine or to rely on George Washington University to give us, government, the accurate count of how many people die in this horrendous calamity is a natural disaster in itself. How could we government have to rely on private institutions to do our job? When we have to wait for the New England Journal of Medicine to tell us the accurate count of the deaths, and when the Puerto Rican government now has to rely on George Washington University to tell us how many people die in their own territory, it's very sad, and I think the highest form of neglect and negligence. And so I joined this effort to call on a commission. We as government must be responsible and take our own responsibility to ask and get an accurate count. These are people that died. They have families. Those families deserve to know what was the level of tragedy that hit Puerto Rico. And right now we're entering the hurricane season. And unfortunately, the Caribbean is in the pathway of hurricanes. So we will never really be safe. There are still many, many families that have applied to FEMA for help. And because they don't have a deed to their property, because they cannot establish conclusively that they live in those housing, they're not getting the help that they need to rebuild. Over 50% of the applicants have been denied. So we must come together to ask for we government to be responsible enough to get the accurate count. Nosotros en el gobierno necesitamos tener un conteo preciso de cuántas personas murieron en el huracán María. No podemos contar con un estudio universitario o de un periódico, una revista médica. Nosotros somos el gobierno y tenemos la responsabilidad. Así que me uno al esfuerzo para esta comisión. Gracias. And now I introduce to you the great representative from Florida, Darren Soto.
Thank you, Representative Espaillat. I want to start with a moment of silence. I start with a moment of silence because this could be the only federal recognition of over 4,600 Americans who died in Puerto Rico who are still not recognized by this government. But now it's time to give those who fell a voice. We know that this is based upon the estimate of the explosion of the death toll as a percentage after Hurricane Maria. Let me submit to you that the cause of their death was not Hurricane Maria alone, but President Donald Trump and the GOP Republicans' undercut, slow response to this disaster. These are veterans stuck in their homes who could not get access to dialysis. These are seniors unable to communicate with the outside world to get life-essential medicines. These are persons with disabilities, isolated, away from roads, away from hospitals, and young people and expecting mothers who couldn't see their doctors to get life-saving treatment. The question also is, not only are we going to find out what happened, but what will happen to Puerto Rico over the next couple months as we get into hurricane season? Will Congress yet again do nothing? Will President Trump yet again do nothing? And God forbid another hurricane hits that island, they will have blood on their hands. So I am proud to join with Representative Velazquez and others to call for a commission to get to the truth, because these low numbers have justified a vastly underfunded disaster. A $90 billion disaster funded with only $18.9 billion. A $90 billion disaster funded with only $18.9 billion. You are going to have story after story continue for as long as this Congress does not treat this disaster to the greatest extent that it really was. Yo estoy aquí para tener un momento de silencio. Finalmente, una recognición federal por toda nuestra gente quien murieron en Puerto Rico, y en ese día todavía el resto de nuestro gobierno no está haciendo nada. Nosotros tenemos un desastre de $90 billones y solamente Presidente Trump y los republicanos en Congreso quieren tener fondos de $18.9 billones. Y este va a liderar a miles de historias, de tragedias de estas personas quien murieron sin ayuda. Y gracias. And now I'd like to introduce Winnie Stachelberg of the Center for American Progress.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you so much. My name is Winnie Stachelberg. I'm Executive Vice President of the Center for American Progress, a progressive think tank, and we are committed to working with these incredible members of Congress and our coalition allies at the Power for Puerto Rico Coalition to address the issues of Puerto Rico. Donald Trump gave himself a 10 out of 10 for his response to Hurricane Maria as he tossed out paper towels like a carnival barker at a county fair. Meanwhile, innocent Puerto Ricans were suffering in the dark, and thousands, as we have heard today, of American citizens are now estimated to have died because of Maria. My colleagues and I at the Center for American Progress just got back from a week's trip to Puerto Rico, and what we saw there was simply unacceptable. Mothers told us their children cry and cower after hearing thunder. Teachers told us they do not have textbooks for their students. Traffic lights are still out in San Juan. People are still repairing flood-damaged homes, and thousands still lack electricity, and blue tarps dot the beautiful countryside of the island of Puerto Rico. All of this more than 8 months after Trump gave himself that perfect score. To make matters worse, virtually everyone we spoke with told me that it was way too difficult to get help from the federal government, even though Congress has approved billions of dollars in aid. For months, FEMA applications were only available online, even though much of the island lacked electricity. FEMA's applications are also filled with complex rules and red tape that prevent many low-income families from securing support. Much of the guidance of these applications still is available only in English, and many FEMA inspectors came to Puerto Rico without any Spanish language skills. Given all of this suffering, I have one simple question to ask. Where is the outrage? That's why we're here today, to make two fundamental demands from the administration and from Republicans in Congress that can secure greater action and accountability for the people of Puerto Rico. I heard from people in Puerto Rico that they're not just worried about the aftermath of Maria, they're also worried about the next hurricane season coming now. So first and foremost, FEMA must enact new plans of action for hurricane response that will make sure that this kind of catastrophic negligence never happens again. FEMA officials must pre-position supplies on the island and prioritize Spanish language responders, officials, and resources for the people of Puerto Rico. And crucially, they must directly empower community-based organizations and local leaders, especially mayors, working on the front lines of this crisis. Puerto Ricans have their own creative and strategic ideas around recovery and rebuilding. We must listen to them and get them the funding they need. And second, we need to fight for the existence and independence of oversight bodies like the one that was discussed today in Puerto Rico that can monitor the ongoing recovery and rebuilding efforts. We've already seen that this administration can't be trusted with reporting the truth about the situation on the ground. The people of Puerto Rico and their allies throughout our country need an independent set of eyes and ears to hold people accountable and learn from the past mistakes so we don't repeat them. I promise we at the Center for American Progress will keep fighting until this administration acknowledges and acts to stem the crisis unfolding in Puerto Rico, and I know that you will too. And now it is my honor to introduce Federico de Jesus with the Power for Puerto Rico Coalition, of which we are a proud member. Thank you.
Buenos días. Good morning. My name is Federico de Jesus. I'm the I'm here to represent the Power for Puerto Rico Coalition. I'm also the co-founder of Boricua Activate, a diaspora empowerment nonprofit organization. I would like to thank Representatives Velazquez, Meng, Serrano, Gallego, Espaillat, and Soto, all of whom are staunch champions for Puerto Rico. Muchas gracias. I also want to recognize Ms. Winnie Stalkberg from CAP. Thank you so much. And our other speakers. 4,645. Let that sink in for a moment. 4,645, the number is so staggering. Mothers, fathers, nephews, sisters, grandchildren, Puerto Ricans, U.S. citizens, human beings. They all perished because of the devastating Hurricane Maria and the aftermath that followed. What is sadder still is that for tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans on the island and in the States, the hurricane is not over. More than 14,000 homes remain without electricity 9 months after the storm. Thousands more are still in temporary housing without being able to go back to a home with a roof or electricity, running water, or other basics. The hurricane is definitely not over. For those who have power in theory, but like my mother last weekend, have power outages that are constant. The roads still do not have working traffic lights, and so many other vicissitudes that Puerto Ricans face every day. The recent study that was just mentioned by Harvard and Carlos Albizu University shows that 4,645 lives were lost thanks to the hurricane. It came 9 months after the storm. That is unacceptable. And that is why we need an urgent investigation to get to the bottom of this, whether it's through congressional hearings, a 9/11 style commission, or a GAO investigation. There need to be real consequences for what happened. After all, this was one of the deadliest, if not the deadliest storms in U.S. history. And what the Harvard study and other research found is that many of the deaths were preventable. Regrettably, the federal neglect and inefficiency compounded the effects of the storm, and that would have never have been nearly as deadly were not for the government's mismanagement. From the day our coalition came together, we have warned lawmakers and administration officials that this was not an ordinary disaster, that an ordinary response would not cut it. Hurricane Maria's destruction turned Puerto Rico into a war zone, and that is why the island, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands, need a Marshall Plan so that we can rebuild, provide meaningful debt relief, and get the island's economy back on track. Congress also needs to approve Congressman Espaillat's bill, H.R. 5475, to ensure that people who have been denied FEMA assistance due to a lack of a property deed title can get the help that they need. If Congress wants to lift barriers for the recovery, it can also remove the unelected Fiscal Control Board from being able to decide where the hurricane disaster money is allocated. And make no mistakes, lives continue to be at risk. We pray that Congress, the Trump administration, and the Commonwealth government finally acknowledge the severity of Hurricanes Irma and Maria and join us in advancing solutions to bring greater transparency, accountability, and responsiveness to the rebuilding process. And let me add one other thing. This is not the moment to privatize the independent Puerto Rico Institute of Statistics. At a moment where we don't know how many people died, now is the time where we need independence and transparency. And allow me really briefly to say a few words in español for our Hispanic media members. Como saben, 4,645 vidas se perdieron y probablemente más como resultado del huracán María y la desastrosa respuesta federal. Sé que tengo que acabar, pero nosotros en Boricua Actívate y la coalición de Power for Puerto Rico estamos comprometidos con exigirle al Congreso, la administración de Trump y el gobierno de Puerto Rico a que reconozcan la magnitud de este problema y se unan a nosotros para urgir una investigación independiente como la del 11 de septiembre. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Federico, and to all our partners and members of Congress who have been here. If there is any question, yes.
You mentioned the slow response due to the numbers. Do you think that $18.5 billion that's been
Allocated
but hasn't been used, do you think the low death count numbers have to do with that?
I believe that the 16 or 64 numbers has so much to do with the kind of allocation that we passed in Congress. So in order to rebuild Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, to withstand any other hurricane, we need to revisit those numbers, because clearly in Donald Trump's mind, it was not a real catastrophe just because the number that was told to him the day that he went to Puerto Rico was only 16. So that obviously was the type of narrative that he used to support his response to Puerto Rico as being adequate, when in fact it wasn't. It is important to know and to investigate how many of the death count happened in the aftermath of Maria, because that will shed light into the inefficient and the neglect of the federal government disaster relief effort to Puerto Rico. Yes, we are working on a legislation that will be introduced next week. Any other? A commission, 9/11 style commission, yes. Well, I think that it's important that we use everything, the bully pulpit that we have here, to raise how inadequate and how the Trump administration neglected and failed fellow citizens in Puerto Rico. Whether or not the window that we have here will allow for such a commission to create will depend on public pressure and public opinion. So it is important that we continue to raise the issue that we have failed the people of Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands today are not ready for this hurricane season. Yes. Well, I don't know. That is a relationship that they have, and that is a decision that will be determined between the governor of Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican legislature, and the oversight board. But I believe that the rebuilding of Puerto Rico is a decision that has to be made by the people of Puerto Rico and the government of Puerto Rico.
Can I add something to that really quick? Right now, Congress mandated that the Fiscal Oversight Board be in charge of certifying that all the hurricane disaster relief funding from the federal government be certified as being in compliance with the Fiscal Oversight Board. That creates a lot more bureaucracy, and so we're calling on Congress to remove those barriers and have a community-led driven oversight and reconstruction effort.